The following is a production of Texas Lutheran University. For more information, please visit tlu.edu.
Good evening. Welcome to the Alpha Chi Academic Symposium on Academic Freedom. My name is Ashley Burks, and I'm the president of our chapter of Alpha Chi. This symposium is sponsored by our TLU chapter of Alpha Chi as an academic program on our campus. That is one of the requirements for being designated as an Alpha Chi Star chapter. And on March 27th through 29th, 5 of us, Dr. Beck and his wife, will be going to St. Louis, where Ashley Meadows, Brandy Halisack, Kelsey Cooper, Forrest Wells, and I will be presenting our research papers on the program of the annual National Convention of Alpha Chi. And if you see that there are copies of the Alpha Chi Recorder Alumni Edition, which you're encouraged to take in order to read more about Alpha Chi. And now I would like to introduce someone who has always been more than willing to support our organization, the Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dr. Debbie Cottrell.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Alpha Chi Symposium on Academic Freedom. I want to be sure to say at the outset that I really applaud Alpha Chi for taking on this important and timely topic, and I would also say complex topic, and I look forward to hearing more from our panelists tonight and also from our audience on this concept that is so central to the life of a university, whether you think about that all the time or not. To set the stage for tonight, I want to offer just a few observations. I am a historian, and from my work in the history of education, I would say with certainty, without any doubt, that academic freedom has been and continues to be one of the most important tenets in the life of universities in this country. Students may not think about that all the time. I think faculty think about it quite a bit, but regardless of who or who is not thinking about it, I can assure you that it's a very important philosophical underpinning for what happens in American universities. We connect to this concept of academic freedom through the long reach of history, going back to scholars such as Socrates and Galileo, who were punished for sharing their ideas. And we know that in more recent times, there have been examples in our country of teachers who have lost their jobs or have threat of losing their jobs when they taught about issues such as Darwin's theory of evolution. This kind of shutting down of individual pursuits and ideas because they don't fit in with prevailing concepts or don't conform to the regulations or expectations of society has been recognized over time to be dangerous and undermining to what universities stand for. If ideas can only be shared because they fit a certain concept or agree with a certain approach, then that would seem to be a very serious limit on what we're trying to do in higher education. And so those things need to be protected, and that is really what academic freedom is all about, protection. Over the years, academic freedom has been seen as important not only for the individuals that it protects, say the faculty members in the classroom or the students in the classroom, but also to society at large. In the 1950s in this country, which many would see as a time of some repression in the United States, but in the 1950s, our U.S. Supreme Court, in a ruling that favored academic freedom, noted that to impose a straitjacket on intellectual leaders at colleges would, in fact, imperil the future of our nation. So they made a pretty sweeping claim that academic freedom was important not just to places like Texas Lutheran University or the University of Texas, but to the entire nation. Now, it's always a little tricky when we take a topic up like this to think about what does it really mean, and what is the definition? What do we hold on to as we're having a discussion about academic freedom? And the definitions range. If we went around and asked people on campus, what does academic freedom mean to you, you're going to get a lot of different responses. Some people would say that academic freedom is simply the free search for truth. If I'm in the classroom teaching, my obligation, my right, what I should be able to do is to put forward a search for truth, in whatever direction that might go. Others would say, kind of in a spirit of addressing the element of fear, I guess, that academic freedom is an ability to teach or to communicate ideas without fear of punishment. faculty member can say what he or she thinks is important without being fearful that they're going to be punished for that. Others broaden it and say more specifically that it's the freedom of teachers and students to teach and to study and to pursue knowledge without any kind of interference, whether that interference comes from the law or from the institution or from the public. A little bit more of a sweeping view of academic freedom. And still others would say academic freedom means that you are advancing knowledge without any restraints, maybe tying back to that concept to truth and to openness. If you think about those definitions and what I've said to this point, maybe you would think that academic freedom is sort of a pure good, that it's about something that's pure and desirable, that's something that makes other things better. Perhaps you would even say it's logical. Why would we not do this? And that it's clearly a way to offer important protections to the concept of teaching and to the flourishing of ideas. And I suppose if I ask most of you, are you in favor of the flourishing of ideas, you would probably say, yeah, that's a good thing. That's probably a good thing for my college to be doing. But we would miss something important tonight if we didn't stop to think about the full story of academic freedom and the many ways that for all of its pure and noble concepts, it is also incredibly controversial. With the lines between freedom and repression often a lot fuzzier than what we would like or hope for. And why is that? I think it's because often what is being protected by academic freedom can in and of itself be controversial and maybe even disdainful. This is not about the protection of ideas that we like or agree on, the protection of ideas that sit comfortably before us. It's about the protection of all ideas. So what if academic freedom, for me, means that I want to go in the classroom and teach ideas that suggest that one race is inferior to another? Or what if I define my right to academic freedom as a right to criticize the Lutheran Church, but you came to TLU because of its Lutheran foundations? What if in order to protect my academic freedom, I need to put forward ideas that you detest, ideas that violate your values? One of the great things about academic freedom is that whenever you're talking about it, you can always find very, very recent examples of controversies that go to some of these questions I've just posed. Most recently, I think, maybe something's happened in the last day or two, but in the last few weeks, I can tell you that there's been a big controversy in higher education around academic freedom because the American Studies Association in this country endorsed a boycott of Israeli universities for the way those universities treat Palestinian students and scholars. Now, to some, the fact that this academic organization, the American Studies Association, is utilizing academic freedom to draw attention to a repressive nature that it sees in Israel is a good thing. In other words, they are utilizing academic freedom to offer up this critique. But to others, boycotting or suggesting the boycotting of universities of one country simply because you disagree with what they are doing could be seen in and of itself as a violation of academic freedom. Because, some would say, and have said, don't those universities have a right to pursue the ideas that they think are best? So there's the rub. One issue, one voice of criticism, one suggested boycott, and a lot of voices questioning whether this is the best way for an academic association to go about raising concerns. I think another controversial part of academic freedom is when you have something this broad and this idealistic, you can sometimes veer off into areas where maybe there's a desire to use academic freedom to suggest that that's what you're doing, but maybe that is what's going on and maybe it's not. I'll give you an example. At a previous institution where I worked, the administration decided that before any flyers could be put up on campus announcing meetings or campus events, before anything like that could go up on campus, they needed to receive a stamp of approval, a literal stamp of approval by the institution. Now, the administration's view was that this would ensure that publicity on campus was consistent with marketing goals and strategic initiatives. Things were not going to go up on campus if they didn't sort of fit into the whole overview of the campus's focus and what it wanted to market and the directions it was going. I don't know how that strikes you, but I remember very clearly being at a faculty meeting and having a faculty member stand up and say in the faculty meeting, if she could not put a flyer up outside of her office promoting a student field trip without first getting the administration's approval, then she was quite certain that her academic freedom was being violated. And I remember sitting there and thinking to myself, is that a violation of academic freedom? Is it a good or bad idea would be a separate question. Is that what's going on here, though? What ideas of hers, what truth is she advancing that's being lost because of this policy? This seemed a little different to me than Darwin or Socrates or Galileo. It seemed somehow a little bit smaller than those kinds of issues or the kinds of issues that those people had raised. Yet, as I thought about it, maybe she was right. If she couldn't promote something, anything, outside her office door, maybe the institution had reached into her space of freedom and were violating her rights. Maybe. I think that's the thing about academic freedom. It can go in a lot of directions, and maybe that's exactly what had happened in this situation, or maybe we were just creating a big inconvenience, and academic freedom was a convenient place to go to point out the limitations of this idea. Just a couple of other examples. Recently at Georgetown University, the university has come out publicly defending the rights of an adjunct faculty member to post blogs on which he indirectly talks about the assassination of President Obama. In response to that, a spokeswoman at Georgetown, who happens to be a former student of mine, has said this: being committed to the free and open exchange of ideas does not mean that we approve of or endorse each and every statement made by members of our faculty. So in other words, Georgetown is saying, we're going to let him do this. This falls within his academic freedom. We don't like his ideas, but we believe he has a right to express those ideas. I believe, and since I know the person who made that statement, I really believe that what she's really saying is these ideas can be expressed. If he were to act on them or attempt to act on them, that would be a different story. It's been noted that on college campuses today, interrupting a speaker, in case any of you want to interrupt me, is compatible with academic freedom. But preventing a speaker from talking is not compatible with academic freedom. So heckling, interrupting, that's okay. But boycotting, not coming tonight, that would not be okay. Or not letting me come tonight, or not letting our panelists come tonight. All right, I think you get the point. There are a lot of contradictions. There's a lot to think about when we talk about academic freedom. So with all those contradictions and further thoughts to ponder, I'm going to throw it over to the panelists to try to sort us through these challenges and to share their thoughts about academic freedom and to engage with you all further about this. We're going to start with Dr. Clayton Jewett, who is a visiting history professor here with us at TLU this year. And he's going to share some of his thoughts, and then after that we're going to hear from the student representative.
Thank you, Dr. Cottrell. I'd also like to thank Alpha Chi and Professor Beck for setting this panel up. Greatly appreciate that. And thank you to all my students who are here. I know that you had no choice. God is dead. The heterosexual nuclear family is a sham. Your parents are to blame for global warming. The legalization of all drugs will free America. Organized religion truly is the opiate of the masses. Democracy in America is a pure myth. Capitalism is the spawn of Satan. And if Jesus were alive, he would be an economic communist. And of course, I've already told you that God is dead. Academic freedom is the belief that the freedom of inquiry by faculty members is essential to the mission of a college or university, that we scholars should have the freedom to teach or communicate ideas without being targeted for repression, job loss, or in most extreme cases, imprisonment. And many of you sitting there might be saying, well, surely we would never imprison our professors for what they are teaching us. It was called the Red Scare in the 1950s. Now, whether I personally believe the opening statements or not is completely irrelevant. But each of those ideas stand in stark contrast to the widely held beliefs held by young college students. And I should have the freedom, at least, to teach those ideas. Why? Because it is essential to your success. Now, I'm not saying that you need to believe that God is dead or that capitalism is evil in order to succeed. I'm not even saying you need to believe anything I say in the classroom. What I am saying is that students, you need to be open to other ideas. See, every student walks into class with these preconceived ideas based upon your family, your community, your church, or whatever. And it is my job as a professor to introduce new ideas to you, to open your mind so that you can begin to think critically and analytically about the issues that impact your daily life. If all you want to do is come to TLU and be spoon-fed the ideas that you already believe, then I suggest that you give me your, $200,000 that you will spend. Allow me to invest that for you, and in 4 years, I'll give you back 75% of the profit. How's that? That would work out for me quite well. Now, the question we have before us tonight is, do colleges and universities truly allow for academic freedom? Does TLU allow for academic freedom? From my experience as a teacher, academic freedom is on its deathbed. The assault on academic freedom is the result of three forces working together hand in hand. And one of those forces is political correctness. Historically, the term politically correct was used early in the 20th century by the communists, referring to the party line, which provided for correct positions on many matters of politics. That term, politically correct, was later adopted in the 20th century by the New Left and applied to condemn sexist, racist, or homophobic conduct, language, and politics as not being politically correct. So we can thank the liberals in this country in their pursuit of multiculturalism for squashing the freedom of speech, which is an essential part of academic freedom. But of course, we can't just lay all the blame on the liberals. We need to put some blame on the conservatives as well. The right wing also has its political correctness. One does not speak out against war, democracy, capitalism, the family, religion, or even the United States. After all, God has ordained this nation to be the great leader of the world. And any rhetoric, action, or political agenda against those values is simply politically incorrect. Thus, political correctness from both the left and the right amounts to an assault on free speech, a fundamental aspect of academic freedom. The second assault on academic freedom is the culture wars here in America. Now, the culture wars in this country can be traced back to the early part of the 20th century with the rise of Darwinian theory and the conservative backlash to that. The modern culture wars emerged in the 1990s when Bill Clinton, in his run for presidency, announced 3 weeks before the California primary, and his advisors told him not to do this, he announced that he had a vision of equality for American society. And that vision included full equality, regardless of race, gender, or sexual orientation. Well, of course, the conservatives had to respond to that. And in response, Pat Buchanan announced, and I quote, The agenda Bill Clinton would impose upon America: abortion on demand, a litmus test for the Supreme Court, homosexual rights, discrimination against religious schools, women in combat. That's change, all right, but it's not the kind of change America wants. It is not the kind of change that America needs. And it is not the kind of change we can tolerate in a nation that we still call God's country. And the conservatives in this country, in response to Bill Clinton, announced a cultural war for family values. And they were going to restore what they saw as family values to American society. Now, you students might be asking yourself, what the heck does this have to do with what my teacher has to say in the classroom? Well, the cultural wars of the 1990s, whether we liked it or not, it forced businesses, it forced churches, it forced higher education to take a stand on controversial issues. This was especially true for private institutions, religious-based schools that are an extension of the church. Taking the combination of political correctness and the effect of the cultural wars together, look at what we have done in this nation. We have bred a generation of citizens that is hypersensitive to anything that is said and will complain about anything they do not agree with. And if a professor dare challenge a student's beliefs, he or she better be prepared for the administrative wrath that is surely to follow. Because the student will complain to mom and dad. And mom and dad will complain to the administration. And that means the administration then, in turn, has to defend the values and the missions of the university that were solidified during the cultural wars of the 1990s. And this defense is often at the expense of the professor. Because when you piss off the parents, you might just happen to be ticking off the alumni. And now you're talking about dollar bills and the financial support of that institution. And the administration will, in most cases, side with those parents. Don't believe me? At one institution I taught at, it was a History 2 class. In my History 2 class, as many of you know, we're going to talk about capitalism. We talk about socialism, and we will talk about communism. I had a book called The Communist Manifesto on my desk. The chairman of the department walked in, took one look at it, picked it up. He said, "You're not teaching this, are you?" I said, "Well, yes, today." He threw it down on my desk and said, "We don't teach that here. Those are not our values." At one university, I made a statement. We were talking about economic issues and the environmental issues in society and the world. I made the statement that we can blame global warming on the previous generation. In other words, your parents and your grandparents and great-grandparents are to blame for global warming. The student got upset, misinterpreted really what I had said, and went and told his parents that I had blamed them for all of society's problems. The chairman of the department called me into his office the next day and warned me to watch what I say. At that same institution, in the History 2 course, I gave a lecture on the gay rights movement. I hadn't reached my office 2 floors away when my phone was ringing, and the chairman of the department called me into his office and said, "These are not the values of our university. You cannot teach gay rights here. If you do so again," and by now, this is probably the 20th time I've been called into his office over the course of a few years. And he said, "If you teach this again, it will be your last lecture." That was in the fall. In the spring, I had a History 2 course. Sure enough, I taught gay rights. It was my last lecture at that university. They made sure of that. There is a third assault on academic freedom, and that is the colleges and universities themselves. There's a large-scale movement across the country, most evident in the University of California system, to hire lecturers and visiting professors instead of replacing retired tenured professors with tenure-track positions. This in and of itself is an assault on academic freedom. For lecturers and visiting professors who do not have tenure can easily be dismissed or not have their contracts renewed due to their politics, their research, or what is taught in the classroom. Now, I have not been here at TLU long enough to comment on its practices in this regard, but I can say that as a previous lecturer at other universities and as a visiting professor, it is on my mind quite a bit. In order to protect academic freedom, universities and colleges must maintain and extend the tenure process to more individuals. And I would even argue that small and mid-sized colleges stop spending money on projects and hire more professors in order to add to the faculty diversity. After all, colleges are in the business of training young men and women to be the leaders of tomorrow. We're not training you to be drunken spectators on Saturday. So is academic freedom alive and well in most places? No, it's not. Is it being assaulted by the forces of political correctness, the culture wars, and the centers of higher learning themselves? Yes, it is. Now, the minute I say that, there's always an example to the contrary. My experience as a teacher over 15 years has been nothing short of shocking in terms of the assault on academic freedom. What about my experience here at Texas Lutheran? This is my second time to teach here on one-year contracts. And if you ask any of my students, they will tell you that I often tell them that TLU is the best kept secret in this nation. And I believe it is. I honestly do. And part of that reason is because, from my experience, here at TLU, academic freedom is alive and well. At least in my class it is. Not once has Vice President Cottrell knocked on my door or given me a phone call saying, we need to talk. And I hope after tonight that remains so. Students in my classes, even those who think I'm crazy, Don Charles, don't say anything, openly debate controversial issues. They welcome the introduction of new ideas. They want to learn. And those that disagree with anything I teach have simply told me, I see where you're coming from, but I disagree. Some of my most enlightening and heartwarming experiences have been as a teacher here at TLU. For example, last semester, I think my class got sick and tired of me and Hayden just constantly going back and forth about capitalism. And while we fundamentally disagree, I have nothing but the utmost respect for that young man, because he in turn challenges me when he's willing to openly debate. Miss Luther, the same goes with you. Our conversations have been quite interesting. And I appreciate y'all's banter and your willingness to go back and forth and debate those issues instead of being offended. It shows me that the students here truly do want to learn. And you two students, along with the rest of you out there as well, have made me a better person. Hopefully a better teacher, because you've caused me to think. And you've appreciated academic freedom. And I hope one day that you students, when you're out there in the real world, you will look back with gratitude on your time here at TLU. Because it's going to be then that you realize how fortunate you were to be in a place that values academic freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Clayton. We're going to hear from Haley Zarnak now, who's an Alpha Chi member, and I think interestingly is going to add to what you just heard by giving a bit of an international perspective to this topic based on her experiences out of the United States last semester while she was in Harlexton.
Yeah.
Alright, I'm going to time myself so that I don't run the bunch, you guys. That's real bad. As she said, my name's Haley Zarnik, and I was at Harlexton last semester. And I get to follow God is Dead with my experiences in England. So that'll be really interesting. So the question that I want you guys to ask yourselves as you're listening to me is this trivial? Does it matter? When we're talking about things like repression, when we're talking about issues like God is dead, like capitalism is the devil, does what I'm talking about matter? And obviously I'd like to submit to you that the answer is yes, and I'll get around to that at the end. But one of the most common misconceptions I've had since getting back from Harlexton is, did you spend more than 15 seconds actually studying while you were studying abroad? And I'd like to say the answer is yes. And so just to challenge that, I want to talk a little bit about my time there. I took 13 hours. Some of my friends who were a little crazy took up to 17, and balanced all of that with traveling. I had 4 different classes that were supposedly taught by British professors. A lot of other people had some American professors. Mine were all British. And then we had a lecture class where we also had 4 different British professors. So I had experience with 8 different ones. So a lot of what I'm going to say is going to have to deal with the difference between British and American education system, and that's another thing that you might want to keep in mind while I'm talking. All that said, I could probably talk about that for a very long time, but getting back to the topic, how much freedom did I have while I was at Harlexton? For me, I felt notably more constrained while I was at Harlexton than I have ever felt while I was at TOU. Not to say that I didn't have a fantastic time, not to say that I didn't learn more than I've probably ever learned in my entire life, but in the classroom setting, there was significantly less freedom for me. Now that didn't come in the form of having to sign a form, that said that I can't talk about things that are related to homosexuality. That didn't come in the form of professors telling me I couldn't explicitly talk about some things. I'm using this term a lot more broadly than we've been talking about. But I think that my time at Harlexton is a poignant example of how smaller issues are just as relevant to the topic of academic freedom as bigger issues like repression, like dealing with capitalism, like dealing with people's rights. And so I'd like to pose the question, what is academic freedom? Now, Dr. Cottrell talked a lot about this, and I think the most interesting thing that she said to me was that she talked about interference versus restraints. That maybe academic freedom is sometimes about interference, people actively getting in the way of what you're talking about, and sometimes it's just about those restraints that you have that are keeping you from talking about the things that really matter. And for me, that wasn't just controversial things, but it was also the everyday things. And academic freedom meant being able to discuss what's important to me. And that's just as much environmental as it is about interference. You've all had those classes where you can say whatever you want to say, but you can't really say whatever you want to say. While you're more than welcome to actually bring these topics up, you're going to face social pressures, if not more legalistic ones. And that's what I found at Harlexton. There's very much not only a constraint on my classes, which I was forced to take a 6-hour class that I wouldn't necessarily have taken otherwise. In that class, everything that we talked about was very much decided for us. When we had a paper, even though we all had individual topics, we pulled them out of a hat, they were assigned to us. And anytime we had an exam, essentially, the studying leading up to the exam was the professors telling us, this is how we want you to phrase this. This is what we want to see on this exam. That didn't mean that we weren't more than welcome to talk about whatever we want to talk about. That just meant that our grade was probably going to suffer. And obviously, that's just as important because it meant that we weren't discussing the things that mattered in the classroom. It meant that there wasn't much disagreement. And while we were free to talk about things like class and gender and race, while we talked about these things, in fact, at length, we talked about them from a very British perspective. We talked about them without much disagreement whatsoever. In a very, very British way, there was always a consistent pressure on manners. It was kind of like, you listen to what the professors are saying, take it, you can take a sip of tea and leave, and then write on the exam what they've told you to say. When I got back to TLU, I probably have not shut up yet in my classes because I moved from an environment that was very cloistered to one that was extremely open. One in which most of my worldview and most of my perspectives on things that I have today has in fact been formed. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that you can form relationships with professors over the years, which is obviously not a failing of Harlexton because you only have a semester there. Part of it has to do with the British education system, which is also not a failing of Harlexton. But a big part of it has to do with the fact that there was an extreme focus on professors' choices and not necessarily on the students bringing something to the table. And so I want to go back to the original question. Is this a trivial matter? When we're talking about things like repression, does it matter that we can talk about these things in everyday life and in the classroom? And I think, again, that this is the difference between interference and between restraints. When you have an open interchange between students and teachers, then you are allowed much more disagreement and you're allowed conflict with your ideas. It's, again, the difference between interruption and prevention. I can interrupt my professor and bring my ideas to the table, even if I'm not necessarily preventing them from talking. And I think that this very much matters, and it's probably one of the most relevant discussions that we at TLU should be having, because we already know that we don't have to, sign waivers that say we won't talk about stuff. We know that we're not going to get called to the principal's office for talking about certain things, but that doesn't mean that we can get complacent and stop encouraging ourselves to openly disagree and to openly bring our ideas to the table. While I know that I was always free to talk about class, gender, and race, everything that I know about those things, everything that's truly changed my mind has come through conflict. I came to TLU with a very, very specific set of ideas that I was allowed to share. whether or not I was correct. And it was the whether or not I was correct part that really allowed me to grow, because it didn't matter that my professors disagreed with what I had to say. What mattered was that I was allowed to share them. If I hadn't, I would have sat there the entire time thinking to myself, wow, they're really stupid. I can't believe what they're saying to me. It's all wrong. But because I was allowed to bring them to the table, I was allowed to challenge myself. I was allowed to be the one that was thinking, that was presenting these ideas, and have an open interchange with my professor, to be going back and forth and arguing with them. And that was what really and truly helped me to see things in a different light. That was how I learned. So here's the argument I'd like to make. When reasoned conflict is not explicitly encouraged, we allow ourselves to get complacent, and we don't bring our ideas to the table. And for me, this is what happened at Harlexton. Yeah, we could argue with our professor. Yeah, we could disagree. We could bring whatever we wanted to the table, but we weren't encouraged to do so. And so I think that we need to make sure that we're continuously encouraging ourselves, because for me, that's a very big part of academic freedom and a very big part of what it means to be in the academia. To learn is to be challenged, and that means that all ideas must be presented, even when, like me, you're very, very wrong. And so I think for us at TLU, we need to always keep that in mind, that academic freedom is not just about the big issues, that it's also about the everyday ones, and then making sure that we make our voices heard.
All right. I want to ask a couple of follow-up questions to the folks that you've just heard from, and then I want to open this up and hear some of the voices that are out there, and I'm sure all of us do, kind of eager to hear some responses to what you've heard tonight. Dr. Jewett, you have presented kind of a gloomy picture of academic freedom in this country in terms of its decline and some very specific, and I would agree with you, the causes of this decline. And Haley, you're suggesting that you've just been at a place where it's maybe even worse than that, just by virtue of not being encouraged. And so I think the question I would like to throw out to both of you is, how do we avoid the complacency that you just spoke about? How do we make sure that if we believe this is important, and I think what you've heard from the three of us, if nothing else, is that we do believe this is important, then what are those steps that we take to ensure that academic freedom is not only allowed, but is promoted? Because I think part of the, and I'm going to let you all speak, but part of when we think about academic freedom, sometimes I think we tend to define it in the negative. We tend to define it around what we don't do that allows academic freedom to exist. We don't at TLU, for example, ask our faculty to sign a statement that they will adhere to certain values before they can teach here. That could be seen as a way that we promote academic freedom, but that's kind of a negative. It's something that we don't do. I don't make it a habit to call professors into my office to tell them what they can teach and cannot teach. I do sometimes have parents in my office complaining about what professors teach or don't teach, but I don't make it a habit to then see that as that my response to that is to then tell a professor what they can or can't do. I might want to share with them what I've heard, but I don't feel that my job is to then tell them what they can or can't do. But again, you could argue that's a bit of a negative. So let me just throw this out. How do we preserve? What do we do to, as you said, Haley, to ensure that we're not complacent around this critical topic?
Well, I think for me, and perhaps I could talk a bit more about this, one of the big differences that I've noticed being here is one that I'm always allowed freedom in choosing what I want to talk about. And sometimes it might seem like that doesn't matter, but I think it winds up being one of the most critical choices that a professor can make, to allow you to make those decisions and not make them for you. Because then you see what the student cares about, you see what their actual values are and what they really believe. And then more than that, it's being open to criticism and to critical viewpoints by encouraging people to talk about them, by saying, okay, where do you disagree with me? And making sure that you are asking for those opinions constantly. I think that's the difference for me.
That's a difficult question. How do we promote academic freedom or ensure academic freedom? I think one of the colleges and universities, as I've said, need to extend the tenure track process to more professors and hire more professors. There's a shocking move in this country to hire just lecturers and visiting professors to replace retiring tenured faculty. I think it's extremely dangerous. Second thing we need to do, and this is a bigger apple to deal with, I think we need to change the debate in this country. We have been led falsely to believe that the debate in this country is between liberals and conservatives. I think it's a false debate. I think we change the debate in this country to one, for example, of different economic systems. And instead of who's right and who's wrong, let's have a political party based upon socialism, one on communism, one on capitalism. And let's debate that, for example, instead of these values are right and these values are wrong. If we change the debate in this country, the central debate, I think that would ensure academic freedom, or help to promote academic freedom, because it would take away the culture wars and maybe some of the political correctness.
I recognize that it's more complex than just the two different viewpoints. I think that's a great point. One of the things that's come up here that I just want to underscore a bit is this, that if you're following it all, you're seeing that academic freedom has a connection to freedom of speech, and also has a connection, as Dr. Jewett has mentioned, to the issue of tenure and the idea that faculty should be protected, move their way through the ranks, and be protected in that process to say what they want to say in the classroom, to express their ideas without fear of losing their jobs. And tenure is designed to provide that protection. It's designed to allow ideas to be protected in the classroom and beyond. And as he's pointed out, without that, there's no way that you're going to have, I think many people would say, and I would agree with this, that you're going to have anywhere near the same level of academic freedom. You might still have it, but you're not going to have it to the same degree and with the same consistency and the same fullness. Because that is an important part of the higher ed structure. All right, I want to open this up a little bit, and I want to ask a question to the audience, and you all are going to have to respond. Otherwise, we'll heckle you. We'll exert our academic freedom on you and heckle you. I'd like to hear from you all. Any issues that could come up in the classroom that you would have concerns about? Let's flip this around a little bit. Things that you might hear your professors say that you would find difficult to hear, would fundamentally disagree with, would see as an affront to your values. Can you name anything like that you would identify as being just something maybe you prefer that your professors not talk about in class? Yeah.
Well, I would definitely say that if there's a situation where a professor is comparing religion and science, saying that, oh, science dominates the entire premise of religion and we should totally ignore it. I think that's like a very dangerous situations where it's more harmful to the students as opposed to anything else, because that's just undermining the true ideas that lie within science and religion, because those two values should be actually looked upon more. They shouldn't be shunned. They should just be openly expressed without any sort of repression. And I think that's kind of dangerous for a professor.
So in that example, you would see that as more a limitation on the approach than an affront to your values. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Which raises an interesting question too. Does academic freedom extend to cover, you didn't quite go this far, but if a professor is saying things that may not be accurate or may be biased in such a way that they maybe lose the sense of truth about them in your mind, does academic freedom still allow for that to happen? Let me hear from someone else. What's something else that you just would not really want to hear talked about in a classroom?
Don't be shy.
Yeah, I know. You don't want to start calling on people if you don't give them your ideas. Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of things maybe that are kind of make you hold your desk real tight, but as long as you're given a chance to respond and communicate your ideas, I don't think there's a lot that's off limits. For example, in history 2, I had Dr. Jewett, and he's not a fan of Bush, if you don't mind.
You have the freedom of speech.
And I can be criticized too. So, but I really like George Bush and Dr. Didn't, and he said that, and then I was given the chance to say my opinion. So I don't think there's a lot that's off limits as long as you can respond. And I even think in the beginning, he said if you find something too offensive, you can walk out. Like, don't feel like you have to stay here. So that's nice to have that option.
Yeah.
I think going on from what he said is basically like, if we're respecting the professor's academic freedom, then I think we expect the same respect for us. Whereas students need to be able to voice their own opinions in the classroom as well. It can't just be soapbox for the professor. So I think there's not really a topic that I would be like, nope, we're not talking about that. But I mean, as long as we're able to express our opinions and our beliefs on the subject as well, and not shut down. Academic freedom in both fields, basically.
I think that's a great point that I think most of us would come to this topic thinking about academic freedom as the right of the faculty member to teach whatever he or she thinks is appropriate to teach or share ideas. But as you read about academic freedom, if you understand it in some of its most meaningful ways, students are a very critical and inclusive part of that. Imagine that students are part of this in the sense that students can also express their ideas, raise questions, disagree, maybe even leave the classroom if they don't agree. It is, I think, a real key part. If a campus is flourishing with academic freedom, that is going to be a big part of it. Anyone else have a topic that you think, man, I'm not sure academic freedom should go that far. I'm not sure I'd be comfortable with that. Yeah?
The only thing I could really think of is if the professor started encroaching on sort of questioning someone's humanity. And by that I mean, in high school I had a teacher who said that all homosexuals are immediately going to hell. So if it goes into that territory, I think, one, the students should have a right to complain and to walk out. But also I think in that, the professor should be reprimanded in some way, because then they're questioning a student, or they're possibly even causing a student to question their own worth.
So let's take that. Yes, you can. I was going to actually bring the question back to you, but you go right ahead.
I understand what you're saying, because for some students, especially if those comments are targeted towards the gay or lesbian students, then take it personally. But that comment that all homosexuals are going to hell, that is a belief based more likely than not on a person's religious values, religious beliefs. So you might not like that, but in the spirit of academic freedom, wouldn't that teacher have the right to express that? I'm just debating.
Oh yeah, no, I know.
So you might be personally offended by that, but wouldn't I have the right to say that?
To me, it's very, when you cause a student to question like their core, basically just themselves, like everything that they are, I think that's too far. I think it's okay to have those beliefs. It's okay to it's okay to have them and state them maybe with people who you know will be okay with that. And I guess I can argue, I went to a Catholic school, so they figured most people in here will be okay with that. But I know for certain that at least 3 people in that classroom were of the LGBT community, and it hurt them, and they very much questioned themselves and what kind of Christians they were because of that.
Let's hear it. We've got someone else at the table who's going to straighten this all out for us.
No. I just think that, I think you're right. Like, that person does have, academic freedom to state, what they want to say. But I think dialogue is, really important when it comes to academic freedom. And if they're going to say something like that, I would prefer to hear it I believe this, what do you think?
You're right.
Yeah.
I think that's the critical part of it, is that if I were to say something in my classroom and then just end debate and end the conversation, that I would be in the wrong. And that's where my classes, we just sometimes,
You would be hindering
we
their
don't talk about
academic
history, we just talk about things. We can get off on our little soapboxes with each other.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, like you said earlier, that we raised a generation of hypersensitive to anything that could be seen as sexist or racist. So I think us in general, if we hear anything that is related to color or, gay, we stop and like, oh, they said gay. Oh no, what do we do? That's bad or that's good. I don't know. So, I don't know, it's hard to define what's good and bad, what's wrong and right when we're so sensitive to everything. I think people should be able to say whatever they would like to, and then we should not be quite so, I don't know, wear our heart on our sleeve type of.
And you're right, and you'd be shocked, and that's one of the reasons I love this place. I think this, out of all the places I've taught, this is by and far the best place. Because you'd be shocked at how many students at other universities do wear their emotions on their sleeves. And the minute you say something, they're out the door crying.
Mm-hmm.
I had a colleague and I, we used to bet each other on how many people they cry each semester. 3 girls in one semester once. But people are so sensitive. And I warn my students, do I not? I warn you guys that at the beginning of the semester, I'm probably going to offend you somehow. I warn you. And maybe that's why, Professor, we should warn our students, like, look, this is academic freedom. We're going to discuss things. And so, but how do you solve, the question you really have is, how do you solve that problem with students being so sensitive? It's a whole generation. It's not just students. It's a whole generation. People are hypersensitive. I don't have the answer to that. I don't know how we can change that.
Now, basing kind of her question, do you blame the failing academic freedom in our country to the hypersensitive generation, or do you blame it on the universities for not allowing, for allowing the parents to come and complain, and then all of a sudden, oh, well, no, that's kind of over the line.
Oh, that's good. So maybe if Professor Cottrell, when the parent shows up, you just should have a sign on your door saying no parents welcome. that would end the debate right there, and maybe then they would not be so sensitive. I mean, I think you can address that better than I can. You deal with the parents.
Yes, I do, and it's an important part of what I do. But let me get to. I want to hook that back to something you said a minute ago when you said you heard a teacher say something about homosexuality, and then you said, "I think that teacher needed to be reprimanded." All right, so I just want to pick up on that a little bit. So, what does that mean? What am I saying to that teacher about what they've done wrong?
That's a really, I mean, I guess since it was a Catholic school, you couldn't really, because they were sticking with, very much with the, I don't want to offend any Catholics, I'm sorry, but with the more general Catholic belief that was endorsed widely until Pope Francis. But I don't know. It's definitely, it's hard.
Yeah,
but
and I think there's just to maybe think with you on this. We're suggesting, I think, that we think this notion of freedom and maybe not so much reprimanding is a good thing. But a follow-up question has to be, where are those lines drawn? Is it okay for Dr. Jewett to say anything, do anything in the classroom? Is there ever a time when it would be appropriate for me to step in and say, Dr. Jewett, I'd like to speak with you in my office? Or does academic freedom, is it just so broad and wide that anything goes? I think that's a question that you grapple with. And I'll go back to the Georgetown example I gave. If a faculty member is posting, writing, suggesting connections to assassination of a president, is that okay? Do we look the other way on that? Do we say, as Georgetown did, we don't agree with that, but what's more important here is his ability to express his ideas, and where is the line? I mean, I'm pretty sure they're not going to be okay if he acts on those ideas, but where is that line drawn? So all I'm trying to do is say you're raising, I think, what is a very complex issue, and when you say, I don't know, I'll be right there with you to say, I don't always know either exactly where that line's drawn. Let me get back over here.
I think there's a line where it comes to like being able to say personal beliefs between that and I guess giving personal attacks on other beliefs. So I think it's fair that a professor or student should be able to say what they believe without forcing it on other people. So I think like that's part of where like the line where people get controversial is, yes, you can say what you want, but you shouldn't have the ability or right, like in her case, to force that on other people. So just because that professor believed that those people, or that gays would go to hell for their actions, that doesn't mean that everybody in the classroom has to believe that as well. And I think that only crosses the line of academic freedom if that teacher is trying to do that, is trying to make everyone believe that and say, like, you're going to get a bad grade if you think gays aren't going to hell. That crosses the line of academic freedom. So I think,
Yes.
I think Sophia mentioned something that was really important to this, which is that the dialogue is the key.
Yeah.
If you're saying these things and you're saying this is what I believe, you are more than welcome to disagree with me. You're more than welcome to bring your ideas to the table. That's a very different feeling than coming into a classroom where someone just makes that statement. And even if, technically speaking, you could speak up, there's always that feeling. You can always tell when you're truly welcome to say something. And I think some of my greatest learning experiences have been in situations where people have made statements that I've been extremely offended by, but I have felt able to speak up about that.
I'd like to go back to his question about parents. The reason being is because as we're sitting here thinking, all of you go home on the weekends, and I'm sure, Ms. Luther, you've had some very interesting conversation with your family, as we've discussed. Your parents are going to ask you, well, how's school going? What are you learning? And you're not meaning to tell on your professor, but you're going to share what you're learning. And your parents just might sit there and have a private conversation with themselves. Well, we need to call up there at TLU. I don't like what that professor is teaching my son or daughter. So you haven't necessarily complained, but the message your parents are hearing might be something completely different. And so, how do we handle the parents? What do you do? And is handling the parents in a certain manner effective towards securing academic freedom?
You're asking me that question.
I am.
Well, it connects a little bit to what you just said. Typically when parents are in to visit, the most important thing on their mind, well, there's two things in my experience. They want to be heard. They don't want to be dismissed just because they're coming to complain. They don't want to be dismissed. And they have an overriding concern for their son or daughter. That's usually what's motivating it. So I think where you start, I do think it's appropriate to listen, to understand what the issue is. In my experience, more times, by far, more times the complaints that I get are not around ideas or things being said that the parent thinks are inappropriate. I have had that, but it's usually more concerned about unfair treatment of a son or daughter, concern that the student is not going to be given a fair chance in the classroom, which could relate to academic freedom, but sometimes is kind of other issues, I think. But there has to be room for that conversation. Probably the important thing is what happens after that conversation, and to what extent, what is my obligation at that point in terms of sharing with the faculty member what concerns have been expressed to me, but doing that in a way that does not threaten the faculty member's academic freedom. And very rarely, not unheard of, but very rarely have I encountered outright demands. You know, you will get this person out of the classroom, or you must not let this person teach. Most people, that's not where they're coming from. They're coming more from needing some assurance that their student is going to have fair treatment. You know. We shouldn't overgeneralize from my experiences, though. I think it's certainly possible that you would have parents make demands. And it's not, let's don't blame it all on the parents either, because there can be other people out there putting pressure on how ideas are presented in classrooms. And I think you made a fair point. Often other people associated with universities, whether it be alums, big donors, whether they're alums or not, others, faith-based institutions. You can certainly have institutions from the church who will suggest what should or should not be taught, and that plays out in a lot of different ways on campuses. And I think that's another good question for us, and I know ahead of time Dr. Beck gave us several things to think about around this issue of when you are associated with the faith, as Texas Lutheran is, what does that suggest about what should or should not happen in the classroom? How does that become part of the dialogue? Is that relevant or is that not relevant? And I do think that's an important question for us to grapple with, even if sometimes that might be more under the surface than above the surface. But I think that is also a part of what we deal with here. And I would open it up to any of you all for any comments on that. Do you see that being a factor? Oh, we got a red arm over here.
You said earlier, where should we draw the lines? You shouldn't have to draw lines if it's freedom, because there shouldn't be a limit to freedom. And then I think people are just too sensitive. The whole point of getting an education is to learn who you are as a person. So you should be able to, people should be able to question your beliefs. And you're either like, oh yeah, I was right, and it either solidifies your beliefs, or it's making me think maybe that's not what I should be believing. I think people are just a little too insecure, and they don't like being questioned because they don't like feeling like, I don't know, like maybe they're not right. They get a little freaked out. But there shouldn't be limits.
No limits, no lines. All right.
I think several times mentioned students being hypersensitive. So I would ask, is there an appropriate degree of sensitivity that you feel like students should have? And also, alternatively, could it possibly be not so much a problem of sensitivity as a problem of a sense of entitlement, that if you object to something and complain, you should be allowed to make a change? And perhaps it's not so much that a student should be less sensitive to statements made, particularly if they have sexist, racist, or homophobic discourse.
You have to repeat that question.
It goes twofold through the set. First, is there an appropriate degree of sensitivity? And second,
So in other words, can you be sensitive?
yes.
I'll give you that freedom.
But to what, where to use the line of being sensitive versus being hypersensitive when you use the term several times?
I think either you're secure. Well, it's a great. I mean, it really depends on how secure you are. If you are secure and being a woman, and I make a sexist remark, is that really going to offend you? If you're insecure about being a woman, it's going to offend you. Now, then do you have a right to then demand that I alter my speech?
But is my response to that sensitivity to the topic, or is it a sense of entitlement that my opinion should be able to curtail what opinion you share?
I'm not following. When you say a sense of entitlement, from the professor or the student?
As a student, and is it so much the problem that I suppose I do mind what you say and being sensitive that way, or is it that if I believe that because I'm learning something, you should not be able to share it? I suppose I'm separate.
Oh, I understand. It's a sense of entitlement that your ways are and who you are matters, and I should confront that. At one that's what got me into trouble at one university is the students had this sense of entitlement. And anything that you said or did was contrary to their beliefs, you were going to get in trouble, and the administration backed that up.
Would you argue that's a problem of sensitivity, or was it their belief that their sensitivity you should cater to that sensitivity?
Do I believe I should cater to that sensitivity?
No. Did you feel, or do you feel like that's a problem of sensitivity or a problem that they believe that you should cater to?
It's a little both.
Okay.
A follow-up question to that. How would you address the difference between sensitivity and respect?
not my issue. I don't draw a line. Now, with respect, the respect is mandatory. I think it goes back to that. Am I going to allow you to voice your opinion? If I don't respect you, then yes, I'm being insensitive. But if you're sensitive about what I have to say, that's your issue, not mine. And I tell you that, don't I? And if I don't like what you have to say in response, whose problem is that? Who's mine, yes? So, I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I don't see it as a line between it's two different issues.
Yeah, I think it is, but I think sometimes what can happen is if you confront me in a way that I say, hey, wait a minute, that's not okay, you might think, oh, she's just so sensitive, hypersensitive, I can't, and I might think you're being disrespectful and I deserve more than what you've just given me, right? So then it's going to depend on the perspective.
True. And I think as professors, we do have a responsibility, and I do try really hard on this, especially when you've got a type A personality like mine, it does come in conflict with some students sometimes. And I do warn my students that look, we're here to openly discuss ideas, and I tell them they do have the freedom of speech. They can say what they want. If I don't like it, I put it in these terms, if I don't like what they have to say, it's my problem. So that they understand ahead of time, if they're not going to like something that I have to say, then it isn't their problem. And so I think we have a responsibility as professors to warn our students or to share with our students what academic freedom actually is at the beginning of every semester. And say, look, this is what it means. And so in our classroom, we're going to talk about different issues. And that might make you uncomfortable. And you might think that I'm badgering or bullying you, but really I'm not. And so if we have that open dialogue, just about having an open dialogue, I think it's solving any of our problems. And that is our responsibility as a teacher.
Yes.
I think there's a difference, like, depending on context. Like, whenever she said that gays and lesbians are all going to hell, doesn't really provide a strong idea, as whereas if he said or she said that gays and lesbians are frowned upon because they go against societal norms, that's presenting a more educated idea.
Well, and I'm sorry you had to experience that. I wouldn't reprimand that teacher, but I might have a word with how they present the ideas.
Yeah.
And you're right, there are ways to present the same idea
Without disrespect.
without disrespecting the student, yes.
But a question we'd have to ask is, I think the way you put that makes a lot of sense. Does academic freedom only protect one of those approaches, or does it protect both of those approaches? So in other words, even though in the first example you gave, not the best way to put it, right? But should academic freedom still extend to protect the right of that teacher, professor to state it that way?
I think it should extend to, like, where it respects both parties, where one's not restrained and the other one's not offended.
Okay. Then you, in contrast to you over here, you're drawing a line a bit, whereas you were saying the line's no longer.
I feel like freedom is limited whenever you start defending others. That's where, like, laws came into play, because you can't think that your freedom has no bounds where you can take someone else's property and claim it as your own. That's the boundary.
That's where the line is for you.
I feel like the difference where we're getting to is the point where people can't say things that are oppressive, that are backed up by society, without welcoming disagreement, because those are things that make people feel threatened when they're within the classroom and make people feel like they are less worthy, like they're being disrespected as a person. And so when you're trying to deal with issues that are systemic, you have to have some sort of greater responsibility, I think. That's what I feel like we're getting to. You have a greater responsibility when you're dealing with things that are backed up by society, but that might be personally attacking someone.
I think one of the interesting points that's coming out here is that everyone, I think that there's this sort of general agreement that academic freedom is doing a good thing, but everyone in the last 3 voices, or 4 or 5 voices I've heard, has a slightly different interpretation of what that means. And so in the classroom of ideas, no surprise that there would be some controversy and disagreement over the best way for this to work, which is, I think, maybe not a bad thing. Yeah.
I think what some people are defining is like more academic moral. than academic freedom, because as she said, freedom is defined as something that doesn't have limitations, and doesn't have like limits. So, and if there is reformation, then it's not free because you're paying a price for what you're doing. So I think to say whether we're using the words academic freedom or academic moral or respect really matters, because the moral would have to play with like being respectful and not forcing your views on other people, but having an open environment, whereas academic freedom would technically allow everything, no matter what. So I think it depends on if you're taking a literal interpretation of the word freedom or if you're applying it, or if that's the correct words you can use.
I have a question for both of y'all. During your speeches, you both kind of, if I'm going to really simplify here, you both kind of pointed fingers as to who you kind of thought was the culprit here. And I was wondering, do y'all see academic freedom as being the responsibility of a certain party? So Dr. Jewett, am I saying that right? Okay. Dr. Jewett, during your speech, you said the administration has come down on you in the past several times. I can tell that you feel you have a responsibility to present academic freedom in the classroom. And I think what you're saying is that you have kind of beef with some of the administrations that you've dealt with. So do you think that that's their responsibility as the administration to present academic freedom? And Haley, you as well, you mentioned that you kind of felt like professors didn't present it in the best light. So is there a particular party that is supposed to champion academic freedom?
Okay, well, I'm going to kind of connect what you guys are saying. You're talking about academic freedom as compared to academic morals, but I think a key thing to remember is that there's no such thing as everyone having complete freedom. That's not possible. That would mean like I could go out and murder all of you guys because that's my freedom, and that's not how freedom works. So in that light, I think freedom has to be the responsibility of both parties, because there's always degrees of freedom. There's never complete freedom. And so within the classroom, I think what that means is that everyone is free to express an idea without fear that they're going to be harmed for it in any way, whether that be socially or whether that be kicked out of class, get bad grade. They should be able to express that opinion. And I think that's a responsibility both of the faculty members to provide a safe environment, but also of the students to make sure that they're respecting viewpoints and that they're not coming at it from the perspective of anything they say that is different from my opinion is wrong, but they're coming at it from the perspective of, okay, I disagree with that, I'm going to share that. And that's two really different things.
So if I heard you right, you're asking me if the administration should protect academic freedom.
Yes. Basically, I feel like from what I'm hearing is that you feel like you have a responsibility to champion academic freedom in the classroom, and that you need to represent that. So do you think that we need to call on more professors to do that, or we need to call on more administrations to respect them? Like what's the bigger issue here?
Ideally, I'd love for the administration at every university to protect academic freedom, and this is what I hinted at, and that's part of the problem, is that with the cultural wars, institutions were forced, whether they liked it or not, to truly take a stance on controversial issues. And a lot of it in the 1990s, a lot of mission statements and visions were rewritten for universities, and especially for faith-based institutions that were an extension of the church. Because churches had to. When Bill Clinton came in and said, look, equality for all people, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, it caused a scene. And it forced the hand of everybody in this country to take a stand on issues. So now the administration is stuck. For example, and I'll just use Texas Lutheran as an example. The Lutheran Church had to take a stance on homosexuality. What happens if a professor teaches something that is controversial in that sense? The parents don't like it, and the parents complain. What's the administration to do? Because the university, which is faith-based, has to align itself with the church, or they lose dollars. What do? You'd like for the administration to champion that, but you have to realize the administration is influenced by profit and money. And who are you going to sacrifice? It's easier to sacrifice that professor than it is to lose that donor's money.
Or let's put it in this context. Building off of what you just heard, a donor comes forward and says to me, I have the money to give to you to build a new academic building at TLU. This is a building that can serve thousands of students into the future, and I'll equip it with the best of teaching equipment and technology. This will be the best academic building in Texas, and I will fund it fully. The only stipulation I have is you go tell Dr. Jewett that he's got to stop talking about that homosexual stuff in his classes. He's just got to stop doing it. He can talk about whatever else he wants, but he's got to stop doing that. And I said, well, gosh, I'd really like that building, but I'm a little nervous about that scenario. And the donor says, well, you just have to balance what's important here. How critical is it that he be able to express that view versus my ability to give you a building that is going to help hundreds of students learn and have a better future? I mean, that's the sort of extreme case.
Right.
What's the call there, right? Because there's a big, if you've heard anything tonight, there would have to be a big, strong, flashing, wait a minute, hold on, this could be a slippery slope. If I tell him he can't do that, am I going to go there next week and tell him what he can't teach, and then go tell Dr. Beck what he can't teach? All in the spirit of look at all these great things we can do if I just keep everybody not saying the wrong things in class. On the other hand, the positive side of that, what you get out of that, you see. And I just gave you a true hypothetical. I've not been in that situation, but those kinds of things do happen. And I think often, and not always, but often people who have a desire to give to support also like to see that happen in a certain way. Not everyone who gives is willing to give and say, no strings attached, right? So that may be kind of an extreme example, but I do think it's one that you have to think about.
It's not so extreme. That happens quite a bit. And that's why you need to value your time here at TLU. Because Dr. Cottrell would not tell me to stop teaching what I'm teaching. And she is probably one of the nicest people I've ever met, would kindly probably tell that donor to give their money in a different way, and maybe might be able to finagle something out of them. But the academic freedom you have here is precious. And in other universities, someone in her position would tell me to be quiet and accept that $5 billion for that nice building. That happens a lot.
I think what I would do is tell that donor to come to a symposium like this and hear how we think and talk about academic
She's nice about these things.
Not just us, but you all. This has been a great conversation. I think we can all say that we've enjoyed this exchange. We hope we've offered some things for you to think about. We hope you don't go home and think this is a simple and easy concept. And we also hope that you're aware of a little bit more now of the ways that academic freedom is always a part of what you encounter or maybe don't encounter as college students. So thank you all for coming. Do you need to do any kind of wrap up?
Don't forget that there's cookies and punch over there. You should help yourself.
Students at TLU engage in high-impact educational experiences that include civic engagement, aesthetic expression, critical thinking, and a focus on intercultural knowledge in a community that welcomes the interplay of faith and reason.